I've always been curious about the craft of filmmaking. So in this series, I discuss exactly that with the people who make films. My name is Neville Shah, and this is not a masterclass. Thank you so much, Vinil, for doing this. Vinil Matthew, somebody who I have wanted to work with for ever since I remember, and then I got a chance to work with, and I was very excited to work with him. He's the most overthinking person I know in not just as a director, in life. He's so much of an overthinker. So, Vinil, I know that there's so much to discuss because you've done such a great body of work. First of all, thank you so much for being here. Really, on a Sunday morning, I'm just touched. I can't believe that you've done this for me. It's
Like I had a choice.
no, shut up. Okay, Vinil, how can you say this even for this? You do this crap when we shoot also. Like I had a choice. And you
I
make the
like
film
the
you only want.
I like the sliver of that window you're giving me, that I'm free as long as it's between 11 and 12 on a Sunday.
I so before you start watching this, there's a whole bunch of YouTube links that you want to sort of look at. This is all Vinil's work. It's great. It's a great body of work. Vinil, what I want to do is I want to actually sort of start off with two films, and we'll sort of try to keep those two in parallel, and then we'll obviously move around and figure it out. But let's start off with, because when I asked you send me something, you were like, I don't know what to send you, just pick from anything and all of that, and then you finally shortlisted some stuff and you sent me, and you sent me the Silk work and the Nescafe work. The stand-up Nescafe work and the Silk Staircase, which I think was the launch of the Cadbury Silk film. It was the first Silk film or the second one for sure. It wasn't anything before that. So, which one was tougher to do? Because I want to break that down. Which one was tougher? Was it Silk that was tougher to do, or was it the Nescafe one?
I think I wouldn't see it as tough. It was more like if I were to compare it, which one was more fun to do, because they both were
Sure,
extremely cool,
sure.
fun projects to do, work on. Uh, Both were with writers who were like almost very close friends. But Nescafe's script had a lot more work going in because, uh, like, I really enjoy the scripting part of an ad more than, I mean, for me, the execution part is actually like a painful process. But what I really enjoy is jamming and ideating and thinking of, so when you're scripting, but that's where you can really tweaking your idea and stuff. So you have far more freedom, you have far more latitude at that in that time. And also for me in my career, I've pretty much worked repeatedly with certain creatives, and I've worked with them for over years. So what has happened is that you tend to become friends. So you look forward to that process as well. For me, one of the best, I mean, the compliments I've got for Nescafe was when people would meet the actor who played that stand up, and they would ask Hussein, "Oh, you don't stammer in real life." And for me, that was like a really good
Hmm.
compliment.
Hmm.
So it's just not about this guy. It's also how do you tell the story. So he's a stand-up comic, so the jokes have to unravel at a certain rhythm. It has to come at certain
Yes.
points. Uh, so it has to be integrated into the way you're telling the story. So the structuring of the film became critical. There's a very strong emotional base to that story as well because you actually want to feel bad for this guy, but you're also actually smiling at his plight. I mean, you're also laughing. So it's a great bittersweet kind of story which I wanted to tell, and that was what was exciting about it.
The fact that it opens on a joke that works. The screenplay or the film opens on a joke that works. It's not a joke that's him still struggling like he is, where he's apologizing to the Seth, to the guy who is auditioning for. So the film opens on a joke that works. And you still feel for him. I think by around the 15-second or 17-second or something like that, you're like, okay, now I'm feeling bad for the guy. But you first want him to win right up top. So is that also? I mean, I don't even know why I'm asking you this. Is that also thought through in your case? Like, are you like? I think that the graph of the film needs to start here, then drop, then go up, then from an emotion response point of view.
So yeah, I mean, that is part of the layering process, and you're also not just playing with emotions and jokes, but you're also playing with the structure of the film. And for me, that was a a very cinematic thing to do. So basically, you're jumping two timelines. You
Yeah.
also so while you start on the present, where he's actually in the midst of giving a show, he's evidently has got an audience, and there is you see that he's fairly successful. And as that story unfolds, you actually jump back to his past and start seeding in his journey also, as well. So I mean, you could, I mean, I just went crazy in terms of the matrix we had created in terms of how the story had to be like opened up. Though it seems very simple on the surface, because even your jokes intensity has to be have a certain graph to it. Like, you can't have your best joke out in the front. You have to build up to that climax where the joke which works the best has to be coming at the bit. What is the filler? Which are the filler jokes? All that had to be thought through, and that is what made it so much fun, and it gives it that kind of structural depth. Not in terms of emotion or whatever, but and you have to remember that it's actually not a show. I mean, it is a 2 minute long film, but it's also
Yes.
advertising at the end of it. So how do you compress it, make it cohesive? And I went to a lot of these teachers or people who work with people who stammer, and how do you so they gave a syllabus where you actually tend to kind of get stuck. So Hussein then came on board. He had this very vulnerable Vichara kind of look to him, very diminutive guy, and of course he's a fabulous actor, he's a writer, and he also apparently had worked with or had done workshops for people who stammer. So he also kind of knew how to kind of break his speech pattern, and at the same time, it had to feel real and instinctive as well. When you kind of plan it so much, it starts again looking very constructed. So that credit goes to Hussein, because he actually kind of did a good job with it. And then, of course, we had to shoot it. And then, as usual, all my good films I've done, I've always fallen sick on my shoots. And I was having a terrible flu at that time, and I was having fever. But
With your
and we had
mask and
really,
all. Vinyl is the only guy who I know who was shooting with an N95 mask before COVID. So
yeah, so I'm feeling very bad about this, because for about 7 years everybody used to laugh at me for wearing a mask, and now people are just all of them are wearing it, and I don't get any copyright credit for it. So I feel very violated by this point of time.
okay,
But
so wait, now on Nescafe. First of all, I'm so curious. Like, you really like, I've worked with you so many times. I've said to you, we've done so much work together, and every single time your response to a script is अच्छा है लेकिन लिखना पड़ेगा. But I have sent you a script. You know what I'm saying? Like, the fact that the script has actually reached you, but what you end up doing is you sort of look at it from a piece of paper and say, how is this going to translate on screen, right? But you enjoy the writing process just almost as much as anybody. So why direction? Why not a writer?
see, I think people often mistake the process of writing as only somebody who comes with a script. For a writer to start from zero, and he's getting this whole list or PPT or whatever from client, and telling, okay, these are things you need to tick, and this stuff, and this deadline and all, and to come out with an idea which can fit into an A4 size sheet is itself a journey which is very tough, I would imagine, and it needs a specialized skill, kind of, a skill for somebody to churn this out on a regular basis. So that's a specific skill set. Okay, where I come in is I come at a point where you've written the idea, you've taken it to a point, and it's like a relay race. You hand me the baton. It's not.
Correct.
So I don't think it's. A lot of people do get upset. And if you're really hierarchical about it, they'll say, "Hey, but I've written it. Why can't you just go and shoot it?" But that's not how it works, because I would like to partner with a writer and say, "Okay, you've done the difficult task. You've done the heavy lifting of taking the idea till here. But now and you probably are exhausted by the time you reach a filmmaker, because you've gone through that shit coming to a filmmaker. But what you get is a fresh pair of eyes from me, who has not been inundated with all that nonsense which has come before that. And I look at an idea and I say, okay, great. There is a seed of, there's a germ of a film here. There's something. So it's not that I change scripts every time, or I want to rewrite for the heck of it. But
no, I don't think that you rewrite. I think that there is a certain sense of, like, what is it that you're looking for when you get that piece of paper, and you're like, okay, now to translate this to screen. I know authenticity is very important to you. So apart from that, what else are you looking for to saying? Is it just beats? Is it just graph?
What I look for is impact essentially, because you have so much of video and content churning out, that how do you differentiate your film from, or your piece of communication from others? So that's really a challenge, because every form, everything has been tried and tested, and usually it's kind of, so much generic stuff which floats on television. So for me, the first thing is always that, okay, this is the idea, but how do I amp it up in a way where it has a required impact? So it's always that, it's never like there's a problem with the script. It's just that how do I build on it and deliver, or
Mm,
make it
mm,
punchier? And it's not a writer's job, it's
mm,
a director's job, and that's where directors come in. If you were to take this part of the idea and then you build it around this, and then you flavor it with certain things, and you and don't talk about certain parts, but yeah, you kind of talk more about this, that's the kind of thinking. And it's a very abstract process, it's not something which is very structured. But so the first day when I read the idea, it's just like, buzzing in my head, and it's kind of, and I'm sure it's with every director, you kind of looking at which end to kind of catch it from. And it's a mix of, oh, I can do this in music, I can do this in an edit, I can get the actors to do this, or I can cast it in a certain way, or I can shoot it in a different location, or my background music will be this. So then if this music is emotional, then I can go flat on my performance. Or if it's a dramatic story, I'll just pull on the drama everywhere. So there are a lot of these things kind of going on simultaneously when you read an idea. And because you're a director, you know that you have so many tools at your disposal, which a writer doesn't have. But as a director, I know my tools. I know that I have actors, I have music, I have camera, I have sound, and all these things can be varied and twisted and played around with to kind of deliver this.
when you get to the floor, are you 100% sure of exactly what this film is going to be?
Absolutely not. I mean, I really feel it's a weakness I have, because and you've seen me, like, I'm a nervous wreck on shoots. I'm actually very jittery and anxious, because there is a very vague notion of where I need to go. There is a certain kind of a fuzzy kind of sense of destination I have. But mostly I am not clear at all. I'm not a very clear thinking person, because I'm all over the place. So, but usually what happens also is that if the day I am very clear about it is a day I know the film might not turn out nice, because usually then it's a very boring output, because if you can recreate what you have in your head and you kind of get it out on screen, it's probably based on things I've seen before, I've heard before, and it's just a version of that. And I think that would make for a very not so original kind of work
That's an
happening.
excellent point. I never thought it like
So,
that. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah.
because we all feed off things which we've kind of, our stimuli is around the, made of things which we've seen or experienced before. And if you're just going to have a rendition of that, it is just going to be really boring.
Is a 40-day window, which is, you're shooting over 40 days for a feature. Do you try to isolate yourself from watching something else so you can stay in the same mood to keep the pitch the same, or do you? It doesn't bother you. You can shut that out, and when you get on the set, this is my film, and so this is how I'm going to do it.
So the kind of person I am, like, I'm a nervous wreck and I'm like anxiety ridden. So forget a feature film, even for an ad film. The ones I get signed on to a job, or we be on a project or an ad film. Uh, the 3 weeks I live on the project, I have blinkers on. I don't look at anything else. I am completely consumed by it. And that's how I'm as a person. I shouldn't be. I should take it easy and enjoy and chill, and but like most of you know me very well, it's beyond me. So I lose my sleep. I am constantly irritable, and I'm difficult for all the people who have to kind of interact with me, and now people have got used to it. So unfortunately, forget feature films or an ad film. Once I have been assigned a task, I'm like a dog trying to catch its own tail. Like
This is
anything
true
wrong, it's
even
like,
for this interview.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. I can work myself into some sort of uh,
Frenzy.
frenzy for no reason.
Do you enjoy the process of storyboarding? Would you have storyboarded if storyboarding was not important for PPMs, etc.? Would you still have boarded, or would you just get on the set and be like, okay, I know now? Or does storyboarding help you do things?
Usually, like, if it's a film with two people talking on a dining table, I mean, what is that storyboard going to really change? I don't understand because, and it's really funny because we have 30 shots of two people talking, and the only change is that a lip changes from here to there, and then that's the only change you can make from frame 1 to frame 4. So really, there's no point. But because I don't write treatment notes, and clients get really upset about it, so that I have to do something, and then that's the storyboard there.
Vinil,
But usually,
you have written one treatment note 2 years ago for me, which was things to behave yourself. Vinil, don't say things that you did not do. But no, I know you don't write treatment notes.
yeah.
But no, the reason I asked about storyboarding is because, like, how do you decide shot size, composition, image size? Like right now, when we just started, your first thing was Neville, is my image size okay? Uh, how do you decide those things? Like, do you have a favorite lens that you go to? Do you do like in a dramatic piece? And let's just stick with either Nescafe or something that I want to talk about later, which is the bus stop Cadbury film, because there is one particular flaw in that my mind was blown when you discussed it with me on a set. Uh, so, how do you decide shot composition? What is the process there?
So earlier on, when I used to when I was starting my career, I used to be very academic and regimental about my lensing and the uses of lenses and stuff. And but over the years, one has just kind of evolved, and you kind of try to let go. But now it's very instinctive. It's part of your uh, uh, in nature. You kind of start seeing things through lenses. I don't necessarily need a storyboard for that because there's no point coming with a very fixed plan and then not being able to follow it, and then kind of collapsing because you couldn't execute what you kind of thought out. I usually follow a very different process when I shoot a feature, but in advertising, because you're always covering a ass, then you want every conceivable angle taken because the client might suddenly want a shot which you never thought would be important. But so I do take that usual establishing shot, mid and close up that gets taken. But usually it's a choice depending on the narrative and the dramatic nature of the line or the expression being delivered. So let's say if you want to isolate a character from your background, and I'm not talking about image size, I'm just talking about pure feel, where let's say a close-up can be taken by a telephoto. You can take it with 135, you can take it with a 40, you can take it with a 27 or whatever, like a 24 lens. So then you make a decision based on the choice of your actors and how you want to present them. So that's another consideration as well. So I tend to use a lot of 40 and 65 of late. I mean, a lot of the DOPs who I work with know instinctively that I end up using 40 and 65, and I can talk about why I prefer the lenses separately. But
Yeah.
I do end up using a lot of that. But there are times where you want, sometimes we say, oh, let's just have a very wide lens. Uh, as a way of telling, and then we use only wide lenses. Or sometimes it's always, there was a phase where I was very impressed with late 90s South Indian side, South Indian style of shooting stuff. So we used a lot of tele lenses and backlighting and stuff. So there were a lot of films which were shot with 85 and 135, and that also was a phase in my life. So
But is there a conscious decision? I mean, on tech day, do you look at a couple of options? Do you normally go with the DP's instinct, or do you work with DP's who get you? So it's almost like, Vinil, from what we're talking about, I think 65 is good for this.
not just DPs, I think eventually you need to work with a crew which kind of understands you, and then it's much easier. So it's, again, with me, it's a very collaborative approach. Either he convinces me or I convince the other person. I mean, somebody has to be convinced. Coming back to your earlier question about storyboarding, it's when you come on the set, you suddenly feel, hey, this looks better in a close up. So though I didn't plan for it, and I think looks like the close up is better off not fully frontal, but maybe like three quarters, or like profile would be a better shot to take. So those are decisions you kind of take on the set, and you can't see them coming till you are there in that moment.
Environment.
Yeah. So you are kind of prepared for it, and you kind of wait for it. So I have not really locked myself into a certain kind of lens pattern or decision of how to use lenses. I want to actually give you an interesting anecdote. Why? And I don't know
Yes.
if it helps your thing, but so long back there was a film which I had done for Nescafe, and this was when we used to do these goofy commercials for Nescafe featuring Deepika Padukone and Purab, and there was a series where we had Karan Johar and
Yes.
sorry, not getting the stand up Veer Das. Yeah. So there was this film with Karan and Veer Das, and and it was like a rush job because we just got the script, and I think within about 4 or 5 days we had to shoot it, and we were writing the script as we were going to shoot because they were busy and we didn't have time to kind of prep and stuff how we usually do. So
You
and
must
it was
have
supposed
died, no, on that job.
like on every other job, but yeah. So there was a funny, interesting observation, which happened on that shoot because Karan is like, yeah, he's funny. He has a certain timing, the way he delivers his lines, and Veer, of course, is a famous stand-up uh, as well. And everybody was expecting this riot of humor to happen on sets, and they said, okay, they can improvise, and it'll be funnier than what you've written for, and all that jazz. So a lot of expectation, but clearly under prepped, and I was kind of, as usual, a nervous wreck because I didn't know where it was headed. And I followed the usual pattern of telling a story where I said, okay, I'll set it up. There is a wide shot, and I see these characters, and then they start interacting, and then I go to the close up while they start talking to each other, and we keep cutting close ups. But while I was shooting, something was just not working instinctively, and I realized, and I might be wrong, but it's I just realized that Karan was very expressive with his delivery of lines because he was a very expressive actor. The eyes were moving, his face was moving, and and he delivered in his style was quite funny. While we, being a stand-up, was used to being giving lines in a more deadpan, manner. Like he would give his line, and then he would wait for the audience to react. So his performance was completely in contrast to how Karan was
Karan.
expressing it. His face was slightly like deadpan, which flat, but it was still funny. But when you cut, it kind of didn't feel correct. It just didn't kind of come together really well. And I knew I was kind of facing this problem because I had shot Karan's axis first, and I switched to Veer's axis,
V's
and I was
axis.
like, I said, I don't know if this is going to work in the edit. It was just a feeling. So then I realized that this Karan is this almost like 6 feet or 5'11", and Veer is kind of shorter. Maybe the interaction is funnier if I go to a long shot and I shoot them profile, and this conversation happens with the contrast in the height and the size, body size. So you almost see Karan towering over a slightly more tinier Veer, and
V.
it kind of felt the dynamic would be funnier.
Mm.
So when quickly improvised, it was a new axis. We didn't even make the set planning for that
Mm.
axis, but somehow we kind of improvised and we relit and begged everybody to hang on for 15-20 minutes more, and we shot that angle. Now it was a mess when we edited the thing because we would cut from a close up to a wide and back to a close up, which is kind of a very unwieldy way of telling a story. But the point I'm trying to make is that it felt the funniest when you actually shot this in a profile because you could see the contrast. You could play on the contrast of the personalities because when you only shooting close-ups, you kind of take away
Yeah.
everything else, the information
But
else.
what if you went up and tilted down a little bit? Would that have been
That would be
slightly?
a very forced way of
Ah,
communicating a comedy, but not really playing to the distinctive whatever body types or advantages they had, and you could see all that very clearly when you went profile and you saw those difference. And a lot of comedy is actually context, or not just comedy, but everything is relative because it's something you're trying to say in relation to what your surrounding is. And you always have to make it a comparative thing for people to enjoy, whether it's sense of danger or of humor or whatever. So uh, and that was the interesting on the spot learning for me, like how do I play on, and that had nothing to do with any kind of rule book or whatever, but you just kind of improvise on the set, and
tell me about 40 and 65. Why are they your favorite lenses? I know you don't use a 50 a lot, but why do you use 40 and 65?
I like 40 because so when you
It's
like
just
shoot
wider than you want it to be.
at times I find 35 distorts a lot more when you shoot a close up with it. 40 doesn't distort, but it kind of feels very close to you. Like 50 is the other option, but then it kind of flattens the
Flattens
image a
it in.
lot more. So 40 is kind of a sweet spot where you can see the character in relation to the environment. You kind of feel close to the character. You're not distant like a Teddy. You're very close to him. You feel the character. You feel his surroundings. At the same time, not distorting his face. So I find it as a very interesting lens for shooting close-ups. And 65 again, It's not as pretty as 85, where throw things out of focus. It kind of goes tighter, but still gives you a sense of the background. It gives you a sense of relation to the character and the background as well. So they tend to not be extreme lenses in that sense. They still kind of feel more real, feel in between, and kind of hit the sweet spot of in terms of how you want to tell a story.
In the bus stop film, right, there is a huge filmmaking error in that film by most film school students' dictionary, which is you have jumped axis in bus stop, right? And you've jumped axis pretty late into the film. How did you get away with it? I didn't realize it till you told me, Neville, look at it, I've jumped axis. How did you get away with something like that? You've told me the answer also, but for the people.
So firstly, I'm somebody who is not such a big fan of physical continuity as much as of emotional continuity. When I was studying in FTI, and I had this professor who had kind of walked in, he said, yes, you try and maintain physical continuity, you try and respect the axis, but a greater sin is committed if you have an emotional continuity break or a jump in that. So more than axis jump, now if you were to rewind to that bus stop commercial, you see continuity jumps and how. Which is why when people make such a big fuss about physical continuity and axis jumps, and I'm not saying that one should not pay attention to it, because they should. Of course, you should try and match them and stuff. But
Breaking the rules with Vinyl Matthew.
but when you sacrifice a beautiful moment, or you sacrifice a beautiful shot for the sake of continuity, then I just find it's very stupid. And at the end of the day, these rules exist for a reason. These exist because you want the audience or the viewer to enjoy something seamlessly. But if they're not really breaking your rhythm or breaking the way you're enjoying it, I don't think you should take it as a golden rule, or kind of being fixated about it. Coming back to your question on bus stop, in fact, we had this discussion. I remember me and Sanu, who shot the film, discussing about, "Arey, are we jumping the axis now?" So what you're referring to is basically the close-up where we go, like the whole conversation happens while the camera is ahead of the actors, and then there are a couple of shots where you go actually behind the girl and shoot the boy from behind the shoulder. So because the reason was that this character is a cheeky character, and he's trying his luck. He's kind of sneaking in. He's got a very sneaky kind of feel to the way he's approaching the girl, and he's stealing a glance. Now, how do you get the essence of stealing while you're talking? And so when you keep the camera on in front of your character, you felt it had to be a confident character who would, you don't get the feeling of somebody stealing a glance by keeping it in front of him. You got it when you were behind her. So it's somewhere you and the character are privy to his action, but not the person who is looking at, and that kind of felt like you're a partner in crime. You felt like, hey, this guy is like stealing a glance and I'm actually witnessing it. And it kind of also made this character a bit humane, We said,
did you know you were going off axis? Did you know that you were?
Yeah. It was a very deliberate decision. Yeah. It was a deliberate decision. We said you get the feeling more if you kind of go behind the character and let's just catch a glance. And
this was not pre-shoot day. This was done. Sorry, this was done pre-shoot. You knew pre-shoot that you would go behind the axis.
Yeah.
Okay. You told me, so when I asked Vinyl has absolutely not answered the question as beautifully as he answered it when he told it to me. There were two reasons you did it. One was this emotional graph of the minute he starts to chance Maro, till he's a normal person making an approach, you were in the front. The minute he starts to chance Maro, you've gone behind. So that emotional layering also worked. But what also you told me is the reason why it didn't matter to anybody is because there are two senses, and if you keep one sense in continuity, the other sense will never bother you. From what I remember you telling me. So you want to explain that?
So I think it's common knowledge that usually when you're doing a music video and if there's a song, and that's one of those hacks you learn early on, and I think again in film school we kind of figured this out, that you can actually jump axis, you can do whatever as long as it's a song, it is music, and it's not a dialogue which is happening. I mean, mainly that was the kind of rule we followed. So, but I don't think it works all the time. So music definitely helps you to kind of distract from a strange cut.
How much do you reveal to the audience, and how much do you hold off scene by scene? This is long format and advertising. To me, it doesn't really. I know that there would be different things for different projects, of course, but I'm saying, how do you decide that? Because your the way the emotion peaks in a lot of your work. For example, the Nescafe radio jockey film, right? When the camera sort of close ups into, when the camera sort of tracks into the phone where it rings finally, uh, it's a great moment because you've sort of set up that phone so many times till you actually got to that moment. Or in Nescafe, in the stand up comic, around the 53rd second or something like that is where it first patak karke hits you, where he apologizes and says sorry sir and sort of leaves, uh, and for example in like the moment, and you invented that school, I mean, I don't want to say invented, but you invented that school of filmmaking, where line punchline with music like that Vinyl Matthews school of advertising.
That's not me at all. That's not me at all.
Please, yeah, Vinyl. So okay, why is it not you?
No, because there is no like pattern.
Rule.
I would like to yeah, pattern or rule, and you use music for a dramatic effect. You would use it anywhere you would like to, especially when suddenly people are talking and it's all silence, and then music starts at a point. I just find it very rudimentary or very false. And this like people accuse me of another thing which I kind of completely refute or whatever. I like to kind of say that. Like that tehrav hai, or there are pauses you do, you give for the actors, and I don't ever do that, because I like to keep the rhythm natural, and if people are talking, I would only give hold as much as they need to between a conversation, so this extra pause between characters or giving extra intelligence to the actors where they have the moment to think and a teardrop moment happens. These are things I rarely do. So if you rewind and see my work, it's not there actually, because it's purely coming out of a function of what are these type of characters, what is the milieu they come from, what is the nature of the conversation, and how they are interacting, because let's say if you remember that film where this boy and girl are in this the post wedding dinner banquet, whatever, sitting across the table and they're
The
chatting.
Sabha film.
Yeah,
Sabha Ali
yeah, so,
Present.
yeah. So that's a Cadbury's film, and where they're observing some random
मेरे
guys
परिवार
dancing.
में तुम्हारे जैसा कोई है
Yeah.
क्या? हाँ.
Now that cutting has a very different rhythm completely. So you would go as per film, and there is no set pattern. Okay, I'll start the music here, because that would be a very lazy way of communicating. So if you notice, I rarely have music starting at the end of the film. Very rare. I mean, I can't even think of a film I've done that, because I love music, and I have grown up in an era of advertising where jingles were like something which we all enjoyed listening to, and I've as a kid remember recording advertising jingles on a tape and listening to them on my Walkman. That's how much I love jingles, and I really miss that era of advertising where you could have jingles and you could have songs. So, to the detriment of my film, usually I actually force a jingle onto every film of mine. And a lot of my composers who I work with will tell you that how tortured they are, because I actually compose every background score as a song. I have a song structure. In fact, I have a stanza, I have an interlude, I have a cross line. All those things are kind of composed and thought through. So mostly all my films would have music from the first frame itself, whether it's your bus stop film, because you have the guitar start player, the electric guitar, whatever
Yeah.
it plays, or
Yeah.
thing. Every film has music. It might change at a certain point of time, but it never starts at a point of time. And I know
Yeah.
a cooler or more elegant way would usually be to just have very sparse music, or just to underline that moment, and an evolved filmmaker would never uh, go for music the way I go for. But that's just a greed for me to do a jingle for every film. So so it's a very wrong, bad filmmaking technique. But I really love music, and I love jingles, and I look forward to. That's the thing I really look forward to in a film project, to sit with a composer and ideate on. And every film of mine will have some jingle, whether you need it or not. It'll be there. It'll be a song. You could put lyrics and they will function as a song. So whether it's a Cadbury Silk, which the jingle has been going for like now, I don't know, 12 years now, people have been, the same jingle has been going on, or whether it's Vodafone or whatever. I mean, I've done it. There always will be a jingle. So I've never done that three chords or whatever, at least notes coming at a certain point to kind of, which I know is a cooler thing to do. So yeah, I've never done that. It's not me.
Okay, so now tell me about revealing. Like, how much do you reveal to the audience? How much do you hold? How do you set up that scene structure for that emotion to work at exactly the moment that you wanted to work in? Because you're a very crafty director in that sense, or actually more a crafty editor in that sense, because you really know how to pace something for me to feel the emotion when you want me to feel it. I don't know if I'm complimenting you and you're feeling shy about it, but I think that you are very surgical about that. How do you sort of decide how much to reveal, how much to hold off? Like in the telephone for the RJ, it's very rarely that you feel elated by an inanimate object. But when that phone rings, you actually feel something. And obviously the pushing in sort of cinematically helps. And yeah, so how do you elicit that response? How are you surgically revealing, holding back? What is it? What's the process there?
I don't know, Neville. It's probably for me. It's a very intuitive thing now. It's never a studied approach to how I hold on to. I mean, it would be like how you deliver a joke. You kind of have a rhythm inside you. You know that okay, I'll crack a joke. I mean, there's a timing which you are kind of now got used to. You know it works like this. If I hold so. I don't know if there's a studied approach for me to kind of construct something, and it changes from film to film. Now, the specific case of the track-in onto a phone. Now, coming to think of it, I might not do that if I were to shoot the film now because it would be too cheesy for me to do. So there are times also it's a kind of telling you decide for the film. Some films are very real, very natural, and you don't want to make it cheesy. So or you don't want to make it, you don't want to spoon feed the audience so much, where it would feel false. So and you don't want to go so sentimental as well. Like I remember Bank of India commercials long time back, where these two kids are flying in a bus. Uh, that was a very real kind of film. It was just people talking, and again, like the terror was not there. Just to think of it in contrast to uh, how I cut Cadbury's. If you look at the Bank of India commercials, it's a very snappy dialogue cutting kind of film. There's no pushing in. There is no holding onto the camera. There's no milking of the moment. It's done very dry in that sense, and it's very cameras kind of held back. All the Nescafe films, especially the emotional ones, had a very fable-like quality of telling. It was more like you're telling a story. So you wanted you put in all your things into it. You put music, you put lighting, you put camera moves, all the drama comes in. But there are a lot of films where you stay away from it and you keep it very plain, like Vodafone pillow throwing. Where it's not emotional. It's just a single shot, and the actors are acting it out. So there's no
How many
cutting. There's no
takes did
editing.
you do for that?
And it actually the credit should go to Rajiv Rao because I remember shooting that film and I did my customary close-ups and mid-shots and all those things. And Rajiv, as usual, came on, and with Rajiv, he's the softest guy, but he can be really cruel because he'll keep nodding yes, and it's the no. So, and we were like kind of packing up, and he said, "Why don't we take everything in one long shot? Why don't we try that?" Hey, Rajiv, but I've done it. Just try it once. So, and like we reluctantly, I tried it and I said, okay, and then while we were shooting it, both of us kind of realized, look, this can be done in a single shot and might be fun. So quickly went back to the actors and made them change their timing and stuff. And, so you kind of worked it out in actor timings, instead of doing it on the edit. So again, it's very impulsive. It's very intuitive. I don't think there's a set pattern of how you want to tell a story. On the whole, I try and make it real. I try and like the Cadbury Staircase film, which we did together, where this boy,
Chini Kam.
Chini Kam, where you notice that initially when the boy is reaching out to the girl, it's a bit more tentative, so you are slower. And then as he starts chasing her, there is a quickening of movement. Both the camera moves and the cutting is also much more faster till the time where he delivers his line at the end of it, where it kind of gets slower. So it just felt right that this is the kind of graphing you need to do in terms of the pacing and rhythm and stuff. So I just kind of follow the script here. I mean, and I see that I mean, I kind of get a sense that this
But
is how you need to cut.
obviously, even in long format, there is things that you're holding away, that you're holding from the audience, right? Like you're intentionally holding it, but it needs to be there, right? In frame, like in Hasi to Fasi, the whole like backtrack of anxiety and stuff. It's there. It's there throughout the fucking film. But it's held like in some way. So how do you consciously choose? Like, is there a trick, or is it just like I'm not going to address it?
No, but these decisions are made at different stages, and it's not the same every time, because a lot of them could be an edit call when you're cutting something. And right now, I'm editing my second film as well, and you're cutting a scene and you realize that, oh, it's not having a punch, it's not feeling correct. Let's just take this information out and let's see how our audience kind of grapples with that. So a lot of those calls, you kind of arrive at it by tweaking it and in the editing process and with music and all those things. A lot of them, when you're writing itself, you kind of feel, yeah, maybe let's withhold this information, like let so when remember when we were again coming back to the staircase film Chini Kam, the fact that there is a roof, like the last staircase is actually the last floor they come is actually the terrace or whatever. That's information you want the audience to know at a certain point of time. There was no merit in revealing it in the beginning of the film. And you remember, like we said, okay, we go with the flow of the story. We are caught into their romance, and then suddenly, hey, but we arrived at the last floor, and now we kind of stop it there. So it just came organically out of our writing interaction. We felt, okay, this is how we need to write the story, because it will feel correct if you reveal at that point of time. So a lot of it comes out of writing. When you're writing it, a lot of times it comes out of the edit, sometimes it's on the shoot. So I don't know if there is a rule book or there is a theory of how to withhold information. I think it's all part of the kind of story you're telling and then your narrative completely.
Coming to movement blocking, rehearsals and stuff like that. I know you rehearse a lot with actors and stuff. If he's making a movement, it has to be justified, or is it like a little more free flowing, saying अगर उसको घूमना है इधर तो ठीक है ना?
I follow a hybrid approach. I at times when you're working with actors who left, first of all, I don't rehearse with my actors a lot. In fact, what do I do is that once the casting is done and we've kind of selected our actors, I usually call them to office and then we just read the lines once, and I leave it at that, because a lot of times when you over rehearse, you end up having very stale performances to kill all the surprise. And but you kind of, when you're doing the reading, you can gauge and you have a sense of, okay, where is this actor headed? That certain lines might not work on them, or certain expressions you thought while you were writing is not going to suit the actor's face. So you don't have any nasty surprises on set, which has happened a couple of times. So you can eliminate that surprise bit by just kind of meeting them once, getting to know them, being familiar with them, because you don't want to also land up with an actor who's a complete stranger on set, because then it takes a while to break the ice and then kind of push them to a zone where you want them to go. There is a diktat on set that nobody ever talks to actors except me, and unless until I've told them. At times, I take a lot of takes with actors, because what happens is that
At times, Vinil, I don't know of a single shot that you've taken that is under
no,
19 takes.
no,
Okay.
because with what happens is that a lot of actors is that the first few takes comes out of their muscle memory, or their understanding of the world, or their understanding of the script which is given to them. So when you have actors who are, when you're improvising with the actors, you try to make it comfortable for them. So I always have the camera also kind of accommodating their wish list of how they would want to move around.
You have a very weird style of directing where around the 18th or 19th take, you start giving, I don't know if you want me to reveal this, but like you'll start yelling at other people on set to confuse the actor into believing what they're doing is right, so that they fuck up what they were doing to get them to do it. It's the weirdest explanation I've ever received to get performances in advertising. So why do you do this? What is it that requires you to get to that 21st take, Mr. Fincher, Mr. Vinil Fincher?
So this is something which we do with kids a lot, when, you play good cop, bad cop, and kind of works with adults as well. Usually, like I said, actors are very vulnerable people, and they feed off the energy around them. And it's also human nature, how you take criticism or you take a feedback, So same with actors, sometimes they might be getting stuck on a word in a line, get stuck on a word, and then you kind of point it out to the actor, and then they become so conscious about
Conscious.
yeah, that they will never get it right. So you really don't want to point or press at a pressure point there. You would then distract them with something else, while hoping that their pressure point or their stress point becomes something else, wherein they forget this problem and they kind of glide over it. So yeah, you do that scratching around you, but it's very dependent on what kind of actor you're dealing with at that point of time. Somebody is an experienced professional actor. It'd be very stupid for me not to tell him what the problem is and keep beating around the bush. But there are times where you feel that an actor is vulnerable, or
But the
he's
problem
forgetting.
is the amount of new people you cast, you always face that problem. Because so here's how a typical casting session with Vinyl goes. Okay, Vinyl will sell me on a cast. We will do our best to sell it to the client, and Vinyl will be like, "This is it. This is the look." Blah 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 blah. And then on set, Vinyl will be like, "Yaar shit, yaar, इससे तो acting नहीं होती यार. Why did I cast him? Yaar, this is a big mistake." This is every film. This is every film that has happened. Vinyl has been like this, and still somehow or the other he manages to get it. I've actually seen Vinyl you do this, where there was a guy who has given the worst take on the planet, and you have looked at me, you have looked and said, yeah, that was very good. Come on, yeah, guys, lighting to theek karo na, focus pakdo." And then I'm like, what? And you just looked at me and said, what? Why? How can you be like? How do you make a casting? Do you make a casting decision on the basis of looks and then decide that this is what's going to happen, and then you're like, okay, now I'm in trouble, or is the trouble just Vinyl panic?
I think it would be a combination of both because I mean you cast based on various things like I mean I try and get fresh faces as much as possible because they bring
Yes,
a newness and they give a freshness to your film. So for the obvious
which is
reason
why
you
you
want a
cast
fresh.
for as long as the film needs
Yeah,
takes.
yeah. I mean, for me, the
14
biggest
days.
for our team, 14 or maybe a month at times, because
Yeah.
it drives everybody up the wall from my producer to my team to agencies and clients. And the reason we take so long for uh, working on a film is the casting process. We by default cast in six
But
cities, and
but you do enjoy my comments on casting when we're going through your shortlist.
yeah, but you obviously don't want to talk about them because both of us would be in jail.
Yes, that is true.
See, the moment you go beyond two or three takes with any actor, now that actor starts getting on the defensive because he knows that obviously something is not working right, and that is the reason why the director is asking me to take repeated takes. And it is also at times a inefficient way of working because so that actor inside his head is pure guy. The poor guy is panicking. He's like, "What have I done wrong? Why is he wanting more takes?" So you try and communicate with him and tell him, look, it's not you. It's actually probably the problem could be with me, or is that I'm trying to look for something different. Now, if you tell him on his face is that look, what you're doing is great, but it's not what I want. Again, internally he's going to panic. He's going to like start scratching around and start worrying that hey, now what can I do? What can he's trying to please me or he's trying to get it over with. I don't want the actor to
Yeah.
start getting into a chain of panic thoughts where he's like trying to solve a problem because there wasn't a problem. It's just that I want to try something different, and it's very difficult. He feels now if I just go and tell him, hey, look, this is great, but I'm just taking something else. I'm trying to another take. He's not going to believe me, and he's not going to. He's not a fool who would just by me telling him that I'm taking a take because I feel that something else can
But
be
there
done
was
with it.
something else that you told me, and that was a great sentence where you said there is magic in the insecurity of an actor's acting, where once you've gotten them beyond that, out of their comfort zone, and they're really struggling and grappling for things, there is a vulnerability and an insecurity that has crept in, and that's when the most natural performance sort of seeps out because it's fighting for survival at that point, right?
So
So
so again, there is no fixed method to it, but
yeah.
I try and not overbrief the actors, and for the same reason, even for my HODs as well, I don't try to overbrief them because that kills their imagination or their process completely by giving them such fixed instructions and stuff. So I keep it very loose and floaty and abstract at times till I feel the need to be very clear and precise as to what I want. And I keep shuffling between both the ends of the spectrum because there are a lot of actors who need very clear, instructions, and that is also very important because I feel a lot of directors are not very clear with the instructions as well. At times it would be something like take 5 steps. It's not like can you get me a feeling of sorrow while you walk, or can you feel and you give a big huge backstory and you bore the shit out of the actor and he's anyway confused and you've given him a huge as big background story and which has nothing to do with what you want him to do there. It's as simple as telling him, look, I want you to open the door with the right hand and hold this in left hand, or turn to this direction after 3 beats after you leave a line. It's a simple instruction and they will follow it and they'll do it. I feel with actors, it's usually a confidence play, because there are a lot of actors who come a lot of, they overconfident, and they at times come with a very cocky attitude. And I see that reflecting in their performance. And then I try to at times wear
Break
them
them
down.
down.
I keep taking tips where they need a bit of insecurity because they're just so cocky and they're so precise and they give you exactly what you want. But it's very soulless. It doesn't feel correct. It just feels very formulaic or generic or whatever. And there are times where actors are beautifully, and they're first time actors or non-actors, where they're like so vulnerable. They don't know where the camera is looking at them, and then you have to handle them very gently, and you have to
But this
always keep
was true for,
boosting the confidence.
yeah. So I remember casting the Bharat girl. There was something very, when we came to the casting, finally, there was a shortlist between two people. And I asked you, I was like, on what basis have you chosen this person who can't act? Because you knew even before you cast her and we came on the floor that she's not an actress and that she's not going to be able to act. Your reasoning to me was fabulous. Your reasoning to me was, look at the way she dances. Her eyes are always looking down. She doesn't look at the camera while dancing, as compared to the other, auditions that we saw. Why was that important? How did you even spot that? Because I was like, fuck, I was blown, right? So
in Bharat, the dynamic he wanted was that of a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, and who kind of come together or have this moment together where they're just dancing with, fear, without any fear, without any it just
abandon.
no moment, abandon, without it was a moment of pure joy. The idea was that how do you get this sense of coyness, the sense of vulnerability across? Because if it was somebody very confident, then you wouldn't like this Bahu so much. She's almost
That was
coaxed into
also a
dancing.
conversation. That was also a conversation in the pitch of the film.
In a sense, she's breaking a lot of barriers in that decision to go and dance fearlessly in front of her mother-in-law and let herself loose. Because there is this whole social, society dynamic structure where you are supposed to be the Bahu with a gungat on your head, and that also aids the drama more because the travel she has to do with the character who's shy, who's wearing a gungat, and from there to somebody who's going to dance on a street in front of strangers with a mother-in-law is a travel you want. So there is an implied sense of drama in that journey. Now, how do you make it real? How do you make it believable? You want somebody who is kind of coming out of a shell, So if the shell did not exist in the first place, then there's no coming out, To cast somebody who would give you that sense of who would make that breaking of barriers more believable. It was essential that somebody didn't have that kind of confidence, She was somebody who would, when the door is closed, by herself in a bedroom, would dance as good as Madhuri would, or whatever, somebody else. But immediately, if you put a person in her presence, her confidence would go down and she wouldn't be able to perform, And that was the kind of person we needed. And then that's a lesson for working with non-actors. It's not about how people are good or bad with acting. It's just the confidence level you play with on set. And you, with non-actors, you have to really go to that extra length to preserve that confidence in them.
How much do you depend on digital and the post-production process of it? How much do you depend on it? I know you like to get as much in camera as possible, but unless of course you're shooting a film that you can't.
No, I think it's I'm a very hands-on director, so I in fact like to sit on the final mix, and I'm there physically present. I find it very tough to outsource my work, so maybe I'm a sort of a control freak in that sense because pretty much every department I'm physically present. So I like to go through the edit. I like to go through sound mix and stuff. So it's a pretty much same process when I'm doing a VFX film. Of late, mostly a lot of the films are films which have a lot of human dynamics and they don't require a lot of post-production except for one pack shot at the end. So it doesn't really, there's never a choice for me to, make whether should I do it in post or not, because it's usually dependent on the actors and performances and the kind of emotions they deal with or humor. I remember doing a film for Bonneville where we had this guy interacting with a cocoa bean, and we went crazy trying to get the feel of the cocoa bean and the interaction with the environment and stuff. We did MP tourism hand shadowgraphy, we actually shut down the office. We called this guy from Calcutta. We rehearsed for weeks because we had to tell an entire story, and we had to create figures which he had never made before with his fingers, So we had this torch and we kept doing experiments. Then we drew, we made black and white pictures and tried to reduce it to what could be made with fingers. And there was not any online, I mean, whatever was superimposed was done on the offline machine, So, uh, so that was another process. And then we did the Titan. There's a film with Amir Khan where he's chasing light, and I remember that very distinctly because, again, for about 2 weeks, we shut down the office and we just did experiments as to how light would interact, and it's such a crazy abstract concept because he's stealing light. I don't know if you see that film,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
makes sense to you because he's stealing light from a car's headlight or
Yeah.
from a lamp inside a swimming pool to a chandelier, a light shop and stuff. And so how light would behave in different environments. So if it interacts with water, it would be coming out in a sort of bulbous kind of way. If it's in interacting with vapor, it'll be different. So we had like got like the office was filled with various liquids. We would be throwing shampoo, Milkmaid, toothpaste into different liquids and stuff. So it was a great fun experiment. We were like shooting that and figuring out the interaction of uh, how things would interact with in different mediums, and that was very essential because I didn't want to do a quick job of just doing it in post. So we actually shot that. We worked out the speed, we timed it, we saw the interaction, and then we sat with the posters for a month and trying to recreate as much as possible and make it as believable as possible. So it's a kind of rigor I like to follow in anything I do. So same with post, but usually because when if it's not required and if it's not really saving you on logistics, then I don't see the need for post. Then I would rather do it in camera, and you get to see it immediately. You get to see the results immediately. So it's
If you had to shoot something that you've done or something that you've seen and you are like, how could they make this mistake? Which I know you will not answer. So I'm just going to put it on you. If you had to shoot something that you've done again, how would you shoot it differently? Or would you shoot it differently?
we evolve during different phases in our life. Like I remember when I started my career, I wanted to do advertising because it's a cool thing to do, and you really wanted to get those cool visuals you saw on those, shorts DVD, and really wanted to try out all your tricks and stuff. And I would spend 24 hours grading a film. Now I not won't spend more than 2.5 hours. And I would spend a week on online. Now hardly go to online machines now. So I had a phase where I wanted to tell things in a very sentimental way. So the camera and the music and lighting would kind of go. So it's at what phase of your life you are and at how evolved are you at that point of time. So it keeps changing every month, every year because, and once you do a thing, once you kind of hit upon a style and you do it 2, 3 times and you get bored with it and you don't want to redo it again. So, you kind of, you want to puke it the next time and you get that script and you're told to do the same thing. You're like, gosh, I can't do it because it just feels so formulaic.
Okay, one word answer, Vinil. Film, would you rather still be shooting on film or do you love the digital medium?
Well, I'm very happy with digital medium.
Because you can do retakes?
No, it is like when I was shooting film, I used to love film. And I always kept saying, I would be the last person in Bombay, but I'll keep shooting film if possible. I know there's that green texture and that the romance of film and all those things. And yes, I understand all that, but I think the sheer convenience of shooting in digital, the freedom it allows you with actors, the freedom it allows you with shooting in a certain manner, I think it completely overweighs the romance and the fine details of filmmaking.
So then I'm going to move to my penultimate question. Say, again, this is a one-word answer. I know you've done FTII, you've done a filmmaking workshop as well somewhere. Where? Germany. In Germany, you went to film school. Germany only, you went in Munich Film School. Yeah. So you went to Germany. You did FTII. Would you advise someone who is coming through the ranks to study or pretty much start being third AD, fourth AD, second AD?
Depends on that. Depends on the individual and at what age has he decided to become a filmmaker. So if you, any film school with certain amount of rigor and depth to their teaching, and I would always recommend that over just going and joining the industry because
so a couple of ones that are there right now. Couple of ones that are there right now that you would recommend.
So I went to FTI, and I also went to the Munich HFF, which is the Munich Film School, for a year before I made my graduating film from there. But I can tell you that FTI is a place which really shaped uh, a lot of things for me in how I perceive films. I'm not somebody who was born in a film family, and that era we never had access to foreign films
Yeah.
or cinema in general. Right now, because the internet access is much more easier, but it really um, encapsulated a lot of those things which I would have learned in a very hard way. It made simpler and it structured it for me and it kind of gave it to me on a platter in those 3 years, and it really shaped me as a filmmaker.
Final question, William Matthew. Final question. Uh, Things that you should be reading, that you should be watching, and don't say everything, but stuff that you definitely need to read, watch, listen to, or things that you're watching or listening to or reading right now. That's the last question.
So what I'm reading right now, I have suddenly got this taste of Nordic noir. So I am actually seeing a lot of Scandinavian noir and mystery stuff. There's no reason for it. I just got hooked onto it, and now I'm kind of constantly seeing a lot of that. And I'm reading a lot of Indian fiction translated into English currently. So I was reading Perumal Murugan and a Malayalam author called Benjamin and Vivek Shanbhag. So a lot of Indian writing in English, because I think there's a lot of wealth of stories which we don't read and which we don't access because it's in regional languages. And so when they get written and translated in English, it's a great opportunity for us to learn truly unique stories. So I'm doing a lot of that in the lockdown. It's kind of good reset for me. I'm washing my eyes and ears and system by reading and
But anything that you would watch or podcast that you would listen to, or theoretical books that you need to read, 5 C's of cinematography, story by Robert McKee, any of this, anything that you would
I
screenplay
remember in
writing
film.
by Sid Field.
I mean, to each to his own. I remember a film, a book, two books which are really. There's a film by David Bordwell. I don't remember the title of the book, but I remember he's one of the writers who I used to be very influenced by when I was in film school. I really used to enjoy his writing. I mean, film writing. And there's a book by Carol Rice. It's a book on editing. It's the Bible for all, not just editors, but anybody who has to be in film. It's a very old book, but it stands true even today. And I've read that book what 40 times, and I've read it in various phases of my life. And every time I read it, I discovered something new. So it's a book I would recommend by Carol Rice. Please go and read it because it's a beautiful book.
And what are you watching?
Yesterday,
Scandinavian noir.
no, but I saw a very nice Korean film yesterday, which I saw at Mami last year. It's called The Burning by Lee
Okay.
Chang-dong. Lovely film. It's based on a Murakami short story. But in terms of cinematic treatment, it came closest to what writing was, and that's why I really enjoyed it. So if you can watch it somewhere, go ahead and
What is
see it.
it
It's
called?
nice. The Burning.
Burning Man. The Burning. Oh,
Well, I think it's
okay.
Burning. Yeah, just Burning. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Vinil. Did you have a good time talking and
De-
giving Gyan?
Depends on the edit you do of this conversation.
Oh God, Vinil. Did you not have a good time? Genuinely, wasn't it fun for you? Like reliving
Yeah,
all of this?
yeah. I
Oh.
mean, it was fun. I mean, I could keep talking. Except if you didn't have lunch, I would have kept talking.